Good afternoon, and welcome to the screening of the film Spiritual Audacity, the Abraham Joshua Heschel story. After the showing of the film, we will have a conversation to which you are invited to contribute. Both the screening of the film and the conversation that follows it are sponsored by the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. My name is Mark Massa, and I have the great good fortune to serve as the director of the Blasey Center here at Boston College. We have an embarrassment of riches for you this afternoon, as the conversation after the film will begin with observations by Martin Doblmeier, director of the film, and Dr. Susannah Heschel, the Eli Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College and daughter of Abraham Heschel. Martin Doblmeier has an impressive track record of films, having won 3 Emmys and 3 honorary degrees for previous films about Reinhold Niebuhr, Dorothy Day, and Howard Thurman. Indeed, it was announced just last week that today's film itself has won the Wilbur Award, a much coveted prize for the best film, radio, or social media production having to do with religion. Previous winners of the Wilbur Awards include Morgan Freeman, Oprah Winfrey, Mr. Rogers, and the New York Times. So Martin is amongst his peers. Susannah is one of the most respected scholars of Judaism and anti-Semitism in 19th and 20th century Europe and America. Her previous books include Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, which won the Jewish Book Award for Best Historical Work, and The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany. The Blasey Center is honored to have both Susannah and Martin as guests and commentators this afternoon. Our time will be set up as follows. We will now screen Martin's award-winning film, which will run for slightly under an hour. At the conclusion of the film, both Martin and Susannah will open our second hour together with a conversation about the film. After their comments, you are invited to send in your own comments and questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your computer screen. And now, Spiritual Audacity, the Abraham Joshua Heschel story. Enjoy.
In particular to Susannah Heschel, who I've known now for many years, and to do a film on her father. I mean, that's the thing that I always try to remember. It's not. I come to Heschel because I read the books and I study the subject matter and I get to meet people who were involved in his life. But this is a story about Susannah's father, and I never forget that. And when we talk in the film about how Heschel lost his mother and 3 sisters, that was Susannah's grandmother and 3 aunts that she never had a chance to enjoy in her own life. And so this is deeply moving and personal. And she is a scholar for sure in her own right and done incredible work as a scholar. But this is all deeply personal for her. And I just have a thank you to let me have a chance to even, to be entrusted with the film to tell this story. So why did I want to do it? I wanted to do it because I think Heschel is one of the great figures of the 20th century. He really was. I mean, I think it's safe to say that the civil rights movement is a more encompassing, it's a more complete movement as a result of Abraham Heschel being there on the front lines, embodying the notion that the Jewish story, the story of Moses, would actually be there on the front lines with Martin Luther King Jr. and Jesse Jackson and John Lewis and those folks. I think the Catholic Church is better as a result of the Second Vatican Council, and I think their big document, Nostra Aetate, is clearly better and much more inclusive because of Abraham Heschel. And I think that despite the fact that in 1967, there was a lot of tension around the notion of how should we think in terms of the war in Vietnam? Remember, this is before Watergate, before we came to realize that our country was going to be deceiving us in many different ways. Heschel was out in the forefront of this. He was on the right side of history as we look back at this now. So I think for all those reasons, I wanted to do the film not only for the historic reasons, but here's a seminal religious figure of the 20th century. And like Dorothy Day, like Reinhold Niebuhr, like Howard Thurman, these are people that we can still draw on today, and they still speak to us now, even 50 years later.
So I'm just curious, Martin, just to push that question a little more. How would you say that Heschel, clearly a prophetic voice, an important prophetic voice in the 20th century, how was he alike and different from the other prophetic voices you've made your films about?
Well, that's what's interesting to me. That's a great question. There were intersections. I picked these because I thought they were a great representative. These four characters: Reinhold Niebuhr, Howard Thurman, Dorothy Day, Abraham Heschel, and there were certainly intersections between all four of them. And we know famously, as you saw in the film on Reinhold Niebuhr and Heschel were dear friends. I mean, I would have loved to have been that dog going along Riverside Drive and listening to the conversation that these two men were having during the midst of the war and everything else that was going on, discussing points of theology. So they were intersections that way. Dorothy Day and Susannah can tell this better. Susannah remembers the day that she came home, and there's Dorothy Day at her home, and so her father had been able to invite Dorothy Day. So there were connections between all of them, and yet each one of them, I think, in their own ways, had their own universe that they had to speak to. They were prophetic voices in the sense that they were not going to stand aside and not apply their own particular faith traditions, which they were absolutely schooled and scholarly in, not avoid the opportunity to take that faith tradition and apply it to the great political and social issues of the day. And I think Heschel said this now in the film several times. I try to raise it up several times, that there are moral consequences to the notion of indifference. And I think the one thing that was similar about all those characters that I mentioned that we did films about is they would not stand aside when there were serious moral consequences out there at standing and becoming indifferent to the key issues of their days.
Susannah, growing up in the Heschel household was like being president at a who's who of the religious leaders of the time. I can only imagine your father and you and your mother had regular meetings and dinners with a host of leaders: Martin Luther King and the other leaders of the civil rights movement, the Berrigan brothers, Cornel West, my own personal hero, Reinhold Niebuhr. What was it like being there? Were you aware at the time when you were a teenager that these were like big figures, important figures, and your father was a major player in this?
Yes, of course. And I grew up with enormous admiration for Martin Luther King. He, in so many ways, saved my life too, giving me a sense first of love of the Hebrew Bible and a sense of the importance of the Bible for softening hardened hearts and for changing the atmosphere of a country. And so he was very important to me, and all the figures of the civil rights movement. And I have to say that of everyone that my father associated with in his life, it's the civil rights leaders who love my father and express gratitude to this day. And I want to emphasize that. It's been 60 years, but whenever I see John Lewis or Andrew Young, Mrs. King and the King children, they're so warm and grateful. And President Obama said to me, "Your father is our hero." Now, how many people actually express gratitude for something that happened 60 years ago? But yes, there were some wonderful people who came to our home in those days. I think what was important was both the conversation at the dinner table, yes, and also the atmosphere. It was very unusual in those days for a Catholic sister priest to come to a Jewish home for Shabbat dinner and be present when my father made the blessings in Hebrew and experienced that. And I think they brought with them, they contributed because they came, I think, with the sense of awe at what they were experiencing. And that enhanced also the atmosphere in our home on Shabbat.
Interesting. Your father came in the film, Martin's superb film brought this out. When Europeans and your father came to this country, they were sort of taken aback by almost the flatness, the everydayness of American culture compared to, say, a German university culture. What was your father's sense of the relation of Christian-Jewish relations, say in the United States or in New York City, in comparison to what he had experienced in Germany and in Berlin?
So I think, first of all, all of my parents' friends pretty much were European refugee scholars. And I heard a lot about German culture. I knew the names of all the poets and writers and philosophers from the time I was very little, because that's what they talked about. And I always felt a little bit like a tourist in the United States. I didn't quite know. And I always wanted to go to Howard Johnson. That seemed so American. I wanted to go and see what that was like. But my father was immersed in this. They all were, and they had read everything. And my father came here to this country knowing everything, reading it. And students here just are not on the level. I mean, to this day, let's be honest about it. And it's just the universities in America can be great, but the German universities are extraordinary. In terms of Christian-Jewish relations, I think it was marvelous for my father. Imagine he was in Berlin from 1927 in the 30s. What relationship could he have with whom? He knew Johannes Hempel. Johannes Hempel, I learned, became a Nazi. I found his Nazi documents, and he had letters from the dean of the university signed Heil Hitler. So a relationship with Christians other than the Quakers in Frankfurt, who were very warm and welcoming for my father. And then this country, Reinhold Niebuhr was a great friend, extraordinary. But think about what this means, truly. What is this? Here, one of the greatest theologians in America in the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr, asked my father to deliver the eulogy at his funeral. That's really extraordinary. And historically, think about it. In 2,000 years, this is amazing.
As a historian of American religion, I can think of no precedent for that anywhere in American history. It must have been something unbelievable.
Yes.
Martin, since you become, I know when you make your films, you immerse yourself in the person, so you become sort of the expert in it. What do you think are some of the issues, if Heschel were with us today, what are the issues he would be concerned to speak to us about? And where do you think his voice is most needed right now in American culture?
Well, I pale at the notion of a scholar. I mean, I met so many people in the process of making the film that have studied Heschel's life for so many years. I come in and I play a scholar on TV. How about if I say that? I do the best I can. But I think that he is one of the great characters, and I think his voice would be clearly needed today in terms of what I think is a parallel example of the fact that we have a moral emergency in this country. And I think the one thing that some people will sort of get concerned about Heschel because he likes to speak in hyperbole, and yet at the same time, he is the person who can sort of speak directly with language that emphasizes the crisis that we're in the middle of. I think that's prophet-like. It really is. I mean, that's his example and his model. So he'll take the knocks if he has to, but for using language that's a little extreme, but at the same time, that his model is the prophets, and that's exactly what they did. They talked about the moral emergency that was there. Everything was a crisis that had to be faced right now, and I think he's right about that. I think the moral emergencies in America are manifold. I mean, the issues at the border. I think Heschel would have something to say about that as an immigrant himself. I mean, he comes to this country, he's got to learn, perfect really the fourth language that he's learning. This is quite remarkable when you think about it. He'd speak about the immigrants at the border. He'd speak about Black Lives Matter. Can you imagine Abraham Heschel not standing up for the cause of Black Lives Matter? I don't think so. In fact, he'd be right out in front of the cause, I think. So, and I think one of the examples that we saw last summer with the tragic killing of George Floyd is everybody remarked how it was not just African Americans who were on the street. It was time that white people and a mix of people were on the streets, bringing forth the notion that this has to be stopped. We cannot take this anymore. And I can't imagine Abraham Heschel not being amongst that group that was out there last summer.
And Susannah, where do you think your father's voice would be today in speaking to the Jewish community in the United States? Because he was a prophetic figure both to Christians and to Jews. So what internal issues to American Judaism do you think he would speak to?
So, we are very much at odds with ourselves in each community, and that would have been a grave concern to my father. He felt very strongly that not everyone can be Jewish the same way, that there's got to be different expressions of Jewishness, Orthodox, conservative. He encouraged people to be more religious. He felt strongly about that, but he understood that you cannot have a compulsion that everyone has to be Orthodox, for example. And that respect, I think, comes also from his sense that each human being is unique and that religion has to be authentic to who we are. You can't be Jewish the way your grandparents are Jewish. My father called that spiritual plagiarism. And that, I think, would have been very important to him, how to perhaps bring down the temperature and the tensions within communities and outside. Not everyone, I'm sure, in the Catholic community may agree with every position taken by President Biden, hopefully with his opposition to the death penalty, maybe not on abortion, but nonetheless, we respect one another, and there has to be a sense of support, each for the other, and accept that, as my father said in an interview, that it's the will of God, just as each human face is unique, each human religious expression is going to be unique.
Interesting.
And I
Martin,
want to also just say thank you
I'm
so
sorry.
much to Martin for making this film. Thank you, Martin, and it's been great to work with you,
Thank you.
and I hope we continue.
Martin, one of my favorite sayings in graduate schools, I would have made it shorter, but I didn't have the time. um, and as you know better than I do, making a 1 hour film is much more difficult than making a 2-hour film, because you have to squeeze so much into a very constrained space. If you were producing a 2-hour film about Abraham Joshua Heschel, what would you have included that you weren't able to because of the time constraints?
Well, I was thinking about that. I actually watched the film tonight. I've seen the film now 50, 75 times. And I actually watched it tonight as you were showing it. And I was thinking about that. I think in some ways there are different topic areas that I might want to have explored, but I think I would have given longer time to each one of the chapters. I mean, I'm fascinated with the notion of Sabbath, and his take on the Sabbath. I thought was, I know a lot of Seventh-day Adventists, and I can't tell you how many Seventh-day Adventist pastors have not only read but studied Heschel's book on Sabbath. It's become a seminal reading for them. They've absorbed it, and they see the Sabbath as a moment in time, as he talked about, a cathedral in time. And so I think I would have given more time to each one of the different chapters, as opposed to opening up whole other topic areas. I do want to say too that I've become fascinated with the whole notion of Sabbath even more. We're actually talking now about the possibility of doing a film just on the notion of Sabbath, because I think in some ways it becomes a metaphor for how we think in terms of religion in America, the expression of it in America. And I think Sabbath gathering, whether or not you hold holy and sacred the Saturday or the Sunday, the truth of the matter is I think it's going to be really very different once COVID is over, and how we're going to be gathering together as community and sharing and being with each other as a community after COVID. That's going to be the big question, I think. But I think Heschel talks about the fact that this is absolutely central to who we are as community.
Martin, a question. I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would just add that so much of what my father was concerned with during his lifetime remains to this day a problem. The inequality of this country, the racism, the poverty, what we do with what we call industrialization, what happens to systems of enslavement when we begin industrialization. I felt this year with COVID, and I was able to sit in my home and use my computer to teach my classes and receive my salary. But it felt to me a little bit like a big slave plantation where some of us are in the safe big house and the rest of our fellow human beings are out there endangering their lives, working for us, and being exposed to COVID. And that's terribly upsetting. So the injustices became very clear. And the question is, what are we going to do about them? And what's the relationship then between Sabbath and justice? And I will say that one of the things about the Sabbath, and I just went to a conference at Yale about the Sabbath a few days ago. By the way, I have to tell you about it, Martin. But one of the things is that on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to light a fire in your home. So the cooking is done ahead of time. But my father also pointed out that you should not light the fire of controversy. And one of the lovely things on the Sabbath was that in our home on Shabbat, there's certain topics we didn't discuss. We didn't talk about the Holocaust on Shabbat. We didn't talk about certain political issues. We looked for ways to bring everybody together at the dinner table in conversation. But that's also a religious commandment. And I know a lot of Americans and people around the world are struggling how to come together. So I hope you do make that film.
I'm intersplicing, by the way, this is for the two of you as well as for the folks viewing. I'm intersplicing my questions with questions from our audience here.
Oh, good.
And Martin, before I want to make sure I ask you this. Several people have asked, where will the film be available in the future if they want to view it?
Well, the film begins broadcasting May 5th nationally on public television stations, your PBS station. And we're doing it in May to release it during what is called Jewish American Heritage Month. And we did that intentionally because we thought we would get additional coverage in the media releasing it during Jewish American Heritage Month. But we're also getting the support from the National Museum for American Jewish History in Philadelphia. It's a wonderful museum, and they sort of came up with the idea, or they sort of like are the centerpiece for the Heritage Month, and we're collaborating with them. And the release of it. But if people want to get the film, want to get a copy, can I give a plug? Can I actually say this? We have to do this. So if they want to get a copy of the film, they can either go to Amazon and get the film, or they can come to us at Journey Films. And the hidden treasure at journeyfilms.com is that they can buy the film in DVD, or they can download it onto their iPhone or whatever they want to do. But we also have educational material. We take the whole notion of not just making a 1-hour film, but we have a lot of educational material to encourage and to facilitate the use of the film in congregations and in schools and classrooms and things like that. So that's the added benefit of doing these films.
Wonderful, good. Plug away, I always say. Suzanne, I'm gonna put together several questions from viewers here. What was your father's relationship to other American Jewish leaders, and especially what did he make of the ultra-Orthodox communities, say in New York City, and what was his relationship like to the Orthodox members of his own family?
So as Martin indicates in the film, my father was descended from great Hasidic rabbis. My father was 3 years old when his oldest sister married a Hasidic Rebbe, the Kapitchnitzer, and moved to Vienna. They managed actually to get out of Vienna shortly after the Anschluss and lived on the Lower East Side of New York. And my father had a few other relatives, the Novominsker Rebbe, the Boyaner Rebbe, also whom I knew as a child growing up, and whose children are my first cousins, and we still remain very close. And my father was close to them. I think any time my father had to make an important decision about being involved with the Second Vatican Council and some other kind of issue, Soviet Jewry, he would speak to his brother-in-law, the Kapitchnitzer Rebbe, whom we also would visit. They spoke on the phone at least once a week, but we would also travel in New York City. It was a 1-hour trip to get, to the Lower East Side or then to Brooklyn. But the family is always close. Of course, that is my family, and there was always great love and admiration.
So there wasn't the tension that today might exist between somebody who had been a faculty member at Hebrew Union College or JTS, and then the sort of the ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidim.
First of all, it's family. And someone once mistakenly said that at my father's funeral, my Hasidic family came and took over, which is ridiculous. That's not what happened. And in fact, I had a Hasidic wedding, and my mother, when she passed away, it was a Hasidic funeral. So I think my father felt, and I feel, that Hasidism has teachings that are most important religious teachings in Judaism since the Talmud. And those teachings in the books that my father studied are just extraordinary and beautiful, and really have much to do, much to offer us, to help us heal our souls and bring us together and bring us alive. There's so many, every time I open a Hasidic text, a sefer, I'm just amazed at the insight. And I think so much of it is human. And my father was like that too. He understood what it is to be a human being. He used to say to me, I feel so sorry for you, a teenager. It was so difficult for me to be a teenager. He understood. And I felt that he had experienced himself an enormous range of emotions, and so was able to understand other people's emotions and difficulties and struggles. And yet at the same time, I just want you to know he also had a great sense of humor, and he was a lot of fun to be with.
That's great. Actually, I didn't realize that about the sense of humor.
He was. I'll interrupt. I've had the privilege of listening to, I think, all of the audio recordings of Susannah's father at the different sites that he would actually do talks and things and just do conversations. And he was really quite funny. I guess in some ways, in retrospect, if I would have added a few other things. There was an event that he did at Hebrew Union College. He went back to Cincinnati. I think it was probably around 67. And before I put the audio tape on, I was wondering, well, gee, to be honest, I was wondering, well, how's he going to go over there? Because didn't all go that well when he was there. And the young people who were there, obviously it's all by audio, you're listening to it. They just seemed to love him, and everything he said, they were laughing, having a great time. And he told jokes just like you would up in the Catskills. He was, almost like Henny Youngman, like jokes. And I thought this is a whole other side of him. If I had another hour, I think I probably would have shared some of that. It was just great stuff.
That's wonderful.
But you also notice his use of irony. And I think the prophets also have a sense of irony, and so did Reinhold Niebuhr. And that was also a wonderful way in which he was able to convey and get people to laugh a little with him, identify.
The question for both of you is a Heschel-like person capable in our religious and cultural context today? So is an Abraham Joshua Heschel, somebody with that moral prophetic authority, possible to emerge as an interreligious figure today?
I'll start and say it's not going to be easy. I think one of the things you're asking, Mark, about what they have in common, Reinhold Niebuhr, Dorothy Day, Howard Thurman, Abraham Heschel. I think one of the things that is very vastly different than it was a half a century ago is I think the media in particular would at that time have turned often to religious figures for some sort of moral perspective on the great issues of the day: civil rights, nuclear armament, the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, nuclear war, things like that. They wanted their voice. They really wanted their voice, their wisdom, their sort of biblical grounding. I don't think we do that in the same way anymore. We certainly don't hold up religious figures as authorities on the moral perplexities of our current day. So there are voices probably out there. I think Jim Wallace is a great moral voice that's out there and speaking about these things, but we do not put them into mainstream media. It's much more difficult. Occasionally you see someone like our friend Cornel West show up on CNN bringing some kind of moral perspective, but that's really an aberration. That's unusual, different than it was 50 years ago when people would turn to a figure like Abraham Heschel and ask him, what do you think about this?
Well, I would say yes and no. I think that in the American Black community, ministers do have an important voice, a voice of guidance. It's just that we don't hear much in our mainstream media about Black Americans and Black American communities. So I think it is there, and I think that's important. I also think in certain religious communities that we may disagree with, but certainly in evangelical communities, people listen closely to the minister, and Catholics are very concerned to hear the decisions of bishops. I would say, though, that that's not the same as my father in a few ways. And one of them is that my father was someone who was entirely apolitical. He was a person without guile. He wasn't calculating. He wasn't interested in building a big empire for himself. That wasn't his interest at all. And if anything, when he said, as he often did, that if there's any hope for the future of Judaism in America, it lies with the Black church. Mm. And what he meant was that there was a spirit of piety and a freedom to express piety that you find in the Black church that you don't find in these big suburban synagogues. And for him, when he wanted to pray, he would go to his little small, what's called a shtibel, just a tiny little teeny synagogue of very pious people who weren't interested in a big, what my father called edifice complex, a big synagogue building. And so where does one find someone like that? I don't know. I mean, I would point to Reverend William Barber. To me, he is the moral guide of today for me in our current situation. But there are others as well. And of course, the question is always, what are we worthy of? If we don't have the kinds of leaders we would like to have, what does it say about who we are as human beings? But I do think that what marked my father was his goodness and kindness and compassion and empathy, combined with great brilliance. He was a great scholar who wrote books in 4 languages on almost every single aspect of Judaism. That's extraordinary. And yeah, that's unusual. On the other hand, it's also so great to have something like this film, because one can get guidance from your films, Martin, and from the books, of course. So you keep people alive with your films. You keep my father alive in that way. So thank you.
Thank you. Someone has asked that you've been an important and intelligent voice for gender equality in Judaism. How much of this did you learn from your father, and where might your father have differed from you on some of this?
No, it's really kind of amazing that when I was young, and I would always go as an only child, go to hear my father lecture. And I heard him talk about what's important in Judaism, prayer and study. And yet I was excluded in the synagogue services. I was in the women's section. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't go up. I couldn't read from the Torah. And at school, the boys were studying Talmud. The girls had to go into the library for sewing lessons. And I would say to my father, this is not fair. And he said, you're right, and things have to change. And so I wanted a bat mitzvah, and he supported and arranged it. He said to me one day when I was saying, what should I be when I grow up? And he said, why don't you become a rabbi? And I said, no, I don't think that's ever going to be possible. But he was much more optimistic than I. And of course, women are rabbis now. So he always supported me on these issues. And I think because I grew up.
Were you the first person to ask to be admitted into the rabbinic track at JTA? Is that?
I did write, but I knew they wouldn't take me at that point. Of course, I knew that they weren't accepting women. It's fine. I'm happy as a professor, and frankly, I actually believe that God ordains people not just through seminaries. And I want to say Martin, to all the women who haven't been ordained, priests, ministers, or rabbis, that you too may be ordained by God in God's own way. You don't need to have a seminary or a church to ordain you.
Martin, a number of people have noted sort of your deep digging into the Berlin University relationships between Heschel and the great professors, the great minds who were there at the time. Who were, in your sense, in terms of what you discovered, who were his important conversation partners in Germany in terms of academics, and how did they influence him?
Not sure if I think maybe even Susannah would be better at answering that question than myself.
You know, it's really interesting. I wrote an article about my father and Cardinal Bea. It turns out they both studied with the same professor at the university. And that's amazing. And not at the same time, of course. Cardinal Bea was older. But Eugen Mittwoch, who was a scholar of Islam and also a scholar of Ethiopian history and philology and so on, Amharic, and who became the director of an Institute for Oriental Studies at the University of Berlin. So that was one of his professors, but there were others. My father, as you mentioned in the film, my father was already ordained a rabbi in Warsaw, Orthodox smicha, ordination from Menachem Zemba. And then he wanted to study with the people who were teaching in the 2 seminaries. And some of them were quite distinguished, of course, Leo Beck, but many others as well. And he wanted to know their methods of understanding. How do they read? How do they think? Both the Orthodox and the Reform. Yeah, but my father also studied art history, for example. And he studied Hebrew Bible with an Old Testament Protestant at the University, Berthollet. So there were quite a few. And he went to lectures and to theater and concerts in Berlin. I used to love to hear his stories about his life in Berlin.
Martin, I'm getting more kudos to you from our audience members saying it was a brilliant film, well put together. How long did it take you when you do this? This is a nuts and bolts question from people. When you're putting together something on a very complex, important figure has produced a lot in his time. How do you come up with a narrative? Like, how do you construct a narrative, as you did in this film, that makes sense, that's meaningful for people who knew about Heschel, but maybe not a lot about Heschel, and gets at all these different facets? Like, how long did it take you to do this?
About 2 years. I read everything I can possibly get my hands on, not only his books, but books about Abraham Heschel, papers, writings that I can come up with. And then I do what we call pre-interviews. I call people up and have long conversations, take the notes, so then I feel as though I have something going for me. And then I do a sketch in my own mind. It's like an artist would say, it's sort of a basic sketch out. I sketch out what I think are the important things to get to. And then because I believe in God, I also do my homework, and then I go out there and I try to do the best I can, but open my mind and heart to the fact that there might be surprises along the way, and be open and ready for that. So it takes about 2 years. We spend the last 6 months of that in edit writing. I spend the last 6 months in editing and writing and putting it all together and everything. And you're right, it's one of the great challenges is, to compress it to 1 hour. But I also, here's the other difference, and this is kind of dovetails to what I had talked about the idea about the media, the mainstream media, not turning to religious voices anymore. We have a different climate than we had 50 years ago. And so it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who famously said there's going to be a time in which the religious language that we take for granted won't be understood by many people anymore. What's the notion of redemption, salvation, grace, and things like that? I think that's proven more and more the case. When I construct a film, I'm thinking about the average person in America who would be listening to this, who may have little or no, not only an understanding of who Abraham Heschel is, but no sense of religious background and training. And so I have to navigate very carefully in how I do that. And yet at the same time, I know that the longer value and richness of the film are to the people who do know Abraham Heschel, who want to sort of delve deeper into him and be able to teach him or share him with their congregations. So it's this constant give and take balance that I have to negotiate as I'm going through it. But that's the big difference for me. I think that the religious literacy of people, 50 years later than different than before is quite something different.
Right. Mm-hmm. Susannah, your father emerged early and became a significant beacon, prophetic person for both Christians and Jews. And that bespeaks a certain sort of respect that Christians had for Jewish leaders and vice versa. So the Christian, in a sense, at the time, it was perceived to be a tense relationship, but in retrospect, actually, it was a very good relationship, and your father provided important leadership for Christians as well as Jews. Would you say that same kind of respect and mutual sort of concern for each other exists between Christians and Jews today? I'm trying to put together, this sounds inchoate because I'm putting together about 3 or 4 people's things here. Let me put this in one declarative sentence in English. Compare the Christian-Jewish relationship when your father was involved in the Civil Rights Act to the Christian-Jewish relationship today in American culture.
I feel the Christian-Jewish relationship in America today is pretty good. What would concern me is that sometimes I find Christians and Jews who are liberals in their communities can come together for conversation, and then the conservative Christians and Jews come together, and I mean politically conservative. But the question is whether liberal Jews and conservative Jews can talk with one another, and if the same can be true in the other religious communities. And that's the big challenge right now. Not so much Christian-Jewish, but Jewish-Jewish, Christian-Christian, and so on. That's a question. I also say that my father's great innovations, many innovations in his understanding was, first of all, to say that Jews have something to be grateful for Christians, for Christianity, what Christianity has done over the centuries for Jews. He didn't talk so much about Christian anti-Semitism. Other people can talk about that. Sure, that's there. He knew it. But he also talked about the tragedy for Christians to denigrate the Hebrew Bible. What Marcion, of course, was condemned as a heretic, but he said this tendency, Marcionite tendency, continues to this day. Christians don't appreciate the Hebrew Bible the same way, and it's true. I found it even among friends who were Protestant pastors in Germany, for instance, to this day. So that's one thing. But then he said, so Jews have to appreciate Christianity and understand the gift that Christianity is for Jews. And he said, if Jews in a community are pious, Christians will be too, and vice versa. So of course, the title is No Religion is an Island. We affect each other. And the question is, how can we be supportive of one another? How can we help one another? And that's what I love about his approach. He wasn't interested in having discussions about Jesus and the nature of Jesus's divinity and the Trinity. That wasn't, he wanted to talk about depth theology, about religious experience, about what it means to pray, how it feels when you are in despair and you're struggling and you just can't pray at a certain moment. How do we help one another in those moments?
Martin, do you want to address that, since you've done a lot of digging in Christian and Jewish stuff?
Yeah, and he was serious about it, Abraham Heschel. I mean, one of the things and now I'm sort of always ruminating on the thing that you asked at the beginning, which is, well, else would you have included if you had another hour? Apparently, Abraham Heschel found a way to get down to Gethsemane and spend time with the Trappist monks under Thomas Merton. That would have been a wonderful opportunity to love to have had footage of that, to be able to do that. But that was a sincere effort on his part to go down, because he was very much attracted to the Merton storyline within the Catholic experience. And so there's clear evidence that it was just not theory for him. He actually was trying to reach out. And I spoke to a couple of the brothers who had heard the stories of Heschel's visit. It was only a 24-hour visit, but he left a deep impression on the brothers down at Gethsemane for that time that he did that. And of course, he takes this position as a visiting scholar across the street at Union Theological Seminary.
Literally across the street.
Literally across the street, and he's the first one to do that. So I like music. One of the pop music is a big thing for me too. And I always think of these little enclaves. Greenwich Village in the 1960s was the place to be. Laurel Canyon in the 1970s was the place to be for music. I think Union Theological Seminary and Upper West Side there with JTS right up there, that was a place to be. I mean, that's where everybody was getting together and having coffee and talking about the big existential questions of life. And Abraham Heschel was right in the middle of that. And I think he was a driving force for why that's such an important community.
Yes, and perhaps keep in mind that my parents' guests included both the Berrigan brothers and Richard John Newhouse.
To have been a fly on that particular wall would have been wonderful. So it's would have been great. Susannah, several people have asked this. Who were the rabbis that your father most admired or modeled himself? Especially a couple of people asked about his great emphasis on compassion and the wonderful ways he wrote about compassion. Did he get that from his teachers or from rabbis whom he respected?
Compassion, my father said, was the word that defines Judaism, and the most important word. And so, yes, when he speaks about divine pathos in his book on the prophets, there is in Rabbinic Judaism a term tzorach gavoha. It's an idiom that means a divine need. There is God's compassion for us, but also our compassion for God. And in that sense, yes, compassion was central, and certainly within Hasidism. Should I just tell you one short story? So my father used to love to tell me about his ancestor for whom he was named, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a Hasidic Rebbe in Ukraine. He died in 1825. And he was very charismatic, and people would come to him all day, every day, and they wanted to meet with him and talk to him and to pour out their hearts and their troubles and ask for his help, and he should pray for them, for a sick child. And one day someone asked him, how do you remember all these people? They come all day, every day and ask you to pray for this, for that. How do you remember them? And his answer was, when someone comes and they pour out their troubles, I open my heart and I let their troubles come inside and they make a scar. And when I go to pray, I open my heart to God and I say, look at all these scars. And that story meant a lot to my father, because it also was so much the heart of what it is to be a Hasidic Rebbe. And that was also who he was as a person. I always felt that. But if you just think for a moment, what does it mean to be able to talk to someone and tell them your problems and have them listen in a way that you know that your problems are going inside their heart? or to be that kind of person who can listen in that way. That's extraordinary. And I think sometimes we also have ideas of masculinity being tough and strong and stiff upper lip, etc. And people are a little resistant to a Hasidic understanding of what it means to be a human being, female and male, and the kind of compassion that's at the center for my father. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Martin, a number of people wrote to me and said, tell him not to stop making these things, keep on going. So,
well, wait, tell them I'm turning 70 this year, and I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to be able to do this. I'll keep going as long as I can. But
70 is the new 40.
70 is the new 80 to me. That's what I'm worried about.
What other prophetic voices do you feel drawn to? That you
all right. I mean, the rule number one by a filmmaker is you don't go handing these ideas out. But yes, one of the things that we're looking at too, and if I was going to do one more prophetic voice, I think I might do James Cone. I think James Cone is the name. Up until this film on Heschel, I was out, as you know, in doing public events with these films on Dorothy Day and with Howard Thurman and with Reinhold Niebuhr. And if a name came up more often than not, it was James Cone. Would you consider doing a film on James Cone? And when the tragedy of George Floyd happened last summer, I thought, maybe it's time we put a theological interpretation, a vehicle for theological interpretation to all this. And that's kind of one of my instincts was James Cone. So
yeah, but I want to lend my own voice to theirs. Like, don't stop making these. Okay, so
don't stop, Martin. We need you. Think about one of the feminist theologians who made it possible for women also to become theologians and to be ordained.
Well, the one thing I always say to people, my email is martin@journeyfilms.com. If you have ideas you want to share, please feel free to do that. So
good, we will.
Susannah, we're nearing the end of our time here. You mentioned very movingly that your father didn't like to talk about the Holocaust during Shabbat meals. What did your father make of did your father speak about the tragedy of losing his mother and sisters in the Holocaust? And how often, when he did speak about the Holocaust, what did he make of that as a theological moment for Judaism?
So, there's some things that are just so devastating that we don't talk about it, and certainly not in a light way. So, in fact, that's not something that we sat around and talked about. I think more often my father and his friends would talk about certain professors that they had who had become Nazis. The book by Max Weinreich, Hitler's Professors, was probably cited more than any other in my growing up years. I think they also were horrified by what Heidegger did to Husserl. My father admired Husserl enormously. But in terms of our family, in some way, yes, even to this day, when I get together with relatives, somehow the conversation, when it's not Shabbat, turns to what happened to a cousin's father, grandfather, grandmother, and so on. So we do talk about that. But as the film makes clear, my father said, this is an issue of anthropodicy, not theodicy. How could human beings behave this way? And that was the challenge for us. What kind of people are we that we could do this? And that we continue to kill? How can this be? To kill, to hate, to have contempt for one another? That's impossible. And I think when I was growing up, what was so clear to me then was that religion and race could never be combined. You couldn't be racist and be religious. It was illogical, unthinkable. And then I wrote a book about the Nazi period, and I discovered something very different, and I still can't get over it. And to this day, I don't understand. And that it's about racism. It's also about misogyny, as we saw in Georgia last week. How can this be? And it's also about self-hatred, because I think in some cases people kill because they hate themselves. They hate their feelings, their instincts. so I think we need, all of us in religious communities need to rethink what we're teaching, our moral teaching, so that we don't convey to people something that might, even in a distorted way, allow them to hate themselves for having feelings that God has given us.
You know, Mark, I was going to say that we want desperately to think of ourselves as a good and moral country, but that chapter in American history is not a good one. I mean, there were boatloads of Jews who tried to get out of Europe and come to the United States, and they were not allowed to come into this country. And I saw too that there was some clips that we were able to come into of rabbis who came to Washington, D.C., 1942, I think it was, to petition Congress and to petition the White House to be more open to receiving Jews into this country and to be more attuned to the tragedies that were happening in there, to escalate the intent of freeing some of the concentration camps. And Roosevelt sent his vice president because he didn't want to get involved with it. And so we can be a cold nation when we want to be. We like to pride ourselves in how good we can be, but in fact, history proves that we were not always on the right side of that history.
I just want to put one last, this is a personal thing. I want both of you to put your heads together and do an hour-long thing on Abraham Joshua Heschel as a storyteller. I want to hear some of these stories and some of these jokes. You know, I think I would definitely be up for this. I must say, I love my job, because my job is to get really smart, creative people together and let them talk. You know,
and we love you, Mark.
Yes,
it's a privilege and fun, and you make it very easy. You make it easy to talk about very big, important things and make it sound simple when it's not. So in the name of all the people who are watching us, I want to thank both of you, Susannah Heschel, Martin Doblmeier, for a really interesting and important conversation about the film. Martin, congratulations. It's a brilliant film.
Congratulations.
I wish we could all be there with you guys and go out and celebrate tonight.
Yes.
I do too, yeah. But as both of you know, I have a favorite restaurant in Newton, which I always go to. So would that you were both here that I could do that. And
so grab and go tonight, right?
Exactly. And Susannah and I have a standing date. It's the first time we both feel we're beyond the COVID thing. We're going to go meet to that restaurant and have a drink. Have a very good gin and tonic. So thank you both very much for a wonderful conversation. Susannah, happy Passover. Martin, happy Easter. Thank all of you who joined us, and stay tuned. You can visit our website, which is bc.edu/Boise. We have many other things going on in the future. So thank you, and have a good evening, and please stay safe. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Good to see you, Susannah. Take care.